New York City, summer 1976. The city is heavy with heat. Sirens echo in the distance. Laughter spills out of bars. Young couples sit in parked cars. Music plays softly, windows cracked. And somewhere in the dark, a man is watching. He isn't rushing. He hasn't panicked. He's patient. 6 people would be murdered, 7 more wounded. Random young women targeted. The weapon? A .44 caliber Bulldog revolver. The killer didn't just pull the trigger. He wrote. Taunting letters to police and the press, mocking investigators, feeding the panic, and he signed them all with a name meant to echo through history. Son of Sam. The city responded with fear. Women began dyeing their hair different colors. Couples avoided quiet streets. New Yorkers glanced over their shoulders walking home. A metropolis that never slept suddenly could not rest. His name was David Berkowitz, but he wanted to be called Son of Sam. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, the podcast where we examine the lives, behaviors, and psychology behind the most extreme acts of violence and what happens when the truth finally catches up. Tonight, we trace how one man held the largest city in America hostage, the psychology behind his letters, the escalation of violence, the investigation that ended it all, and what happens when a killer who thrives on attention finally gets caught. Because monsters don't just appear, they build themselves, and eventually, they get caught. The Bronx, just after 1 a.m., a quiet residential street. Parked car, windows down in the summer heat. Inside, 2 teenagers are just talking, laughing. Their night was winding down. Donna Laurie, 18 years old, and Jody Valenti, 19. They were very ordinary plans, ordinary lives, nothing remarkable about this moment. But a man approached them casually. He wasn't wearing a mask, he wasn't shouting, he didn't demand any money. There was no arguing. He just stepped up to the passenger side window and without warning, shot 5 times from his revolver, tearing through the stillness. The sound was explosive, disorienting. He is struck and killed almost instantly. Valenti is wounded, but survives by playing dead as the shooter turns and walks away calmly. Psychologically, this mattered. Because there was no interaction, no escalation, and no personal motive, this rage wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was displacement. A stranger absorbing violence that had nothing to do with her. A random target chosen simply because she was there. Young, female, visible. The attack wasn't about Donna Laurie. It was about the act itself. And New York had no idea what had just started. Just over a month later, on August 10th, 1976, Carl De Niro, 22, and his girlfriend Rosemary Keenan, 21, sit in their car in Queens. Without warning, the man approaches. Same as last time. No words, no confrontation. He just opens fire. De Niro is killed, Keenan survives, and the pattern has started. On August 29th, 1976, Alexander Esau, 20, and his girlfriend Valerie Bethune, 18, are in Brooklyn in their parked car. Once again, sudden gunfire. Esau dies, but Bethune survives. The first shootings share a critical and very chilling consistency. Young couples in parked cars, no robberies, no interaction, and no escalation. There's no personal motive. The violence is displaced, random, and mechanical. This predator is targeting opportunity rather than a particular person. Then almost as suddenly as it began, it just stops. For nearly 11 months, the murders pause. Psychologically, this lull is significant. Experts suggest that Berkowitz might have been planning, observing, or just suppressing his impulses. It could also reflect a deeper need to escalate and perfect his pattern. The break had another effect, though. It lulled the city into a false sense of security. New Yorkers, many thought the nightmare was over, only for it to return with sharper precision. When the killings resumed, they are just as deliberate, methodical, and predictable as they were the summer of '76. And while some were convinced that this was over, others in New York were still on edge. Every parked car with a young woman inside of it was a target. The victims from the year before shared similarities. They were all young women, often with long brown hair, sitting in cars on very quiet streets, alone or with a friend. The randomness, however, made every night feel dangerous. On July 31st, 1977, it started again. Christine Front, 19. She sat in a parked car, unaware that this man was watching her. He approached silently and opened fire. Christine died instantly. Her companion was unharmed, a cruel echo of chance that underscores the arbitrary nature of this violence. Just a few days later, on August 6, 1977, John Deal was sitting with a friend. He gets shot. He survives, but he was permanently blinded in one eye. Then on August 29, 1977, another attack. Stacy Moskowitz, 20, is killed, and Robert Violante survived after being shot, left permanently wounded. These attacks follow the frighteningly consistent method: execution-style shootings. The city trembles, not just at the act itself, but at its predictability. A pattern emerged. A predator is learning, refining his method, and New Yorkers realize that safety is no longer guaranteed and it's going to get a lot worse. New York NYPD decided to create a task force. And by the summer of 1977, David Berkowitz had become this terror stalking New York City streets, but the fear wasn't enough for him. He would take another step, not just killing, but performing, crafting an identity that would grip the public imagination and haunt this city for years. It began with letters. Berkowitz began sending messages to the NYPD and to journalist Jimmy Breslin, inserting himself directly into the story. Suddenly, he was no longer an unseen shadow. He was a character. A presence in the headlines, a name that the city whispered in fear. In the letters, he declared, "I am the son of Sam." He claimed that demons had commanded him to kill. He referenced a neighbor's dog named Sam, a seemingly mundane detail twisted into mythic significance. But this was not just delusion. This was very calculated. Psychological experts point to a complex mix of narcissism and identity construction in these letters. Berkowitz wasn't just reporting on his own acts of violence, he was mythologizing himself, transforming from an anonymous killer into a figure that was larger than life. The letters are very telling in how he frames himself. He actually distances himself from ordinary humanity, portraying his violence as both inevitable and divine. By attributing his murders to supernatural compulsion, he implies this mystique. He becomes the son of Sam, a character that had a narrative arc, a persona with motives, rituals, and symbolism. The killings themselves are now part of the performance. The letters are the script. This is a defining moment in the psychology of the case. Berkowitz is not merely killing, he is branding himself, taking control of the story in the public eye. Every note is designed to provoke, terrify, and dominate attention. Every word is carefully chosen to ensure that the press, police, and the city at large cannot ignore him. In doing so, he blurs the line between criminal and celebrity, perpetrator and protagonist. From a broader perspective, the Son of Sam letters mark one of the earliest examples of what would become the modern media serial killer symbiosis. See, the press, hungry for sensational stories, published his letters in full. And in return, Berkowitz fed them the narrative that they craved. The city became part of his stage. Each article, each headline amplified his notoriety, intensifying the fear in the community and fascinating people. Psychologically, this performance reflects a deep need for recognition and control. Berkowitz's killings alone would have scared New Yorkers, but by inserting himself into the story, he elevates fear into legend. He constructs a persona that survives beyond individual crimes, a mystic, monstrous identity that dominates imagination. In the Son of Sam letters, we see the intersection of violence, media, and ego. Berkowitz's murders are no longer just private acts of rage or displacement. They are now part of his performance, designed to ensure that he is being remembered. And the city, the press, and history are unwilling participants in this stage. He's no longer just a guy with a gun. He is the Son of Sam, the character, the myth, a warning that terror can be crafted as carefully as any story. Now, to understand the Son of Sam killings, we need to look behind the headlines, though. The letters, the body count, and we got to look at the guy holding the gun and the psychological forces that shaped him. David Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. He was adopted shortly after his birth. His biological mother gave him up because his bio dad left. The early abandonment planted the first seeds of rejection and insecurity that would follow David throughout his life. Even as a young boy, he reportedly felt unwanted, and he struggled to reconcile the absence of his birth parents with the affection from his adoptive parents. It was almost like he didn't feel like he deserved to be loved by his adopted parents. Now, compounding this early sense of inadequacy, he would suffer repeated head injuries as a child. And though those details are very sparse, some psychologists suggest that repeated concussions may affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and aggression, vulnerabilities that could later magnify into psychological issues. His adolescence was very troubled as well. He was socially isolated. He struggled to form any meaningful attachments to other children. He experienced repeated failures in early romantic relationships, leaving him frustrated and very resentful towards young women. During this period, he also engaged in arson incidents, setting fire to abandoned buildings. These acts were early expressions of anger and control, impulses channeled into destruction, but not directed at anyone individually yet. A nod to the McDonald triad. Criminologists often group serial killers into types to understand why they kill. This includes the visionary killer driven by delusions, the hedonistic killer seeking thrills or pleasure, the power control killer obsessed with domination, and the mission-oriented killer who targets a specific group they see as undesirable. And Berkowitz fits into mission-oriented type. For him, women were his undesirables. They were symbolic victims, and that self-mythology he used justified the crime against them. Similar to Bundy, Berkowitz was harming women that he found attractive. The difference, though, was the reason behind these killings. Berkowitz's formative experiences with women created several critical psychological themes that would define his later behavior. The first was rejection sensitivity. Many mission-oriented killers share a heightened sensitivity to perceived humiliation, and Berkowitz was no exception. He was socially and sexually inadequate, acutely aware of his inability to connect with women in any meaningful way. Chronic loneliness and the sting of rejection created a fertile psychological environment for resentment to take root. And in his mind, the pain of being unwanted was externalized. Someone else had to be responsible. 2, he externalized the blame. Rather than confront the painful reality that I am unwanted, or maybe do some self-reflection and work on himself, Berkowitz transformed this internal pain into an outward narrative. Women became targets of his hatred. Society itself became a corrupt, immoral force. And when he later invoked demons in his letters, claiming that supernatural forces commanded him to kill, it was just another mechanism to shift responsibility away from himself, framing his violence as not just acceptable, but unnecessary thing. The third thing was his mission-oriented typology, also called the pseudo-commandos. Berkowitz fits very squarely within that mission-oriented killer profile. These killers believe they are enacting justice, eliminating a group of people they see as symbolically or morally corrupt. And for Berkowitz, women were his focal point, but he also viewed himself as participating in a larger moral or cosmic battle, a theme that he reinforced throughout all of the Son of Sam letters. He referenced demons and his adoption of the Son of Sam persona. The murders were ritualized, framed as purposeful acts rather than just random violence. And it's crucial to understand that Berkowitz's actions were not pure psychosis. He was very aware of his surroundings. He was capable of planning, able to manipulate the media and law enforcement. What drove him was this toxic combination of grievance, narcissism, ego, and fantasy enforcement. Every killing reinforced his sense of power and identity. Every letter, every headline fed the myth of the Son of Sam. And in essence, Berkowitz's psychology was a collision of personal trauma and delusional narrative construction. That early rejection and social isolation created deep-seated resentment. Chronic failure with women and mounting loneliness amplified his externalization of blame. And his adoption of that mission-oriented framework allowed him to justify, ritualize, and continually perform his violence, turning fear into a stage and himself into one of the characters. By the time the killings ended, the city had not only suffered unimaginable fear, but Berkowitz had succeeded in creating a persona that would endure in public consciousness long after the bullets stopped. The Son of Sam was not simply a man with a gun. He was a carefully constructed identity, a psychological performance rooted in trauma, grievance, and meticulously cultivated mythology. Now, after more than a year of terror, the city's nightmare would finally end on August 10th, 1977. But the way that David Berkowitz was caught is just as telling as the crime spree itself. It was almost anticlimactic. The break in the case came in an unlikely form: a parking ticket. A woman named Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog when a police officer ticketed a yellow 1973 Ford Galaxy. The car had been parked haphazardly near a fire hydrant, and after the ticket, a man walked by. Cecilia said he looked at her, he studied her, and it scared her. Spooked, Cecilia ran back inside of her house, and just a few minutes later, she heard gunshots. Now, Cecilia thought that the man she saw was the shooter, but frankly, she was pretty scared. And for 4 days, she said absolutely nothing. And then finally, she called the police and told them that she saw a yellow car get ticketed minutes before the shooting started on August 6th. The NYPD rushed to check every ticket that had been written that night in the area, and they met their first bureaucratic nightmare. Now, they knew that that car was owned by David Berkowitz, but David lived in Yonkers. So the NYPD detective, James Justice, had to schedule an interview with the Yonkers PD to talk to David Berkowitz. And during the scheduling call, an NYPD dispatcher named Wheat Carr heard the name David Berkowitz and started venting. Immediately going, "Let me tell you about him. I know him. He lives right behind me." And Wheat went on to give critical information to the NYPD, citing how Berkowitz had shot her father's dog, a Labrador named Sam. Wheat also informed Detective Justice that her brothers, John and Michael Carr, were friends with him and that all three of them were into some dark occult things. All in all, she said David Berkowitz is bad news. Y'all should be careful. He might actually be the killer. Now, Yonkers PD were already suspicious of David Berkowitz because there had been a series of weird break-ins within Yonkers, and those break-ins had been referenced in earlier Son of Sam letters. So they were already looking for the connection between the Son of Sam and the robberies happening in Yonkers. When Yonkers investigators shared their notes with Detective Justice, everyone felt pretty sure they had the right guy. The police decided to go old school, though, knocking on doors, asking people about their experiences with David, and while they were canvassing the neighborhood, there was the car, outside of 35 Pine Street in front of an apartment building. And when they looked inside the windows, there was a gun sitting openly in the back seat. Now, it's not illegal to own a gun, but you're really not supposed to have it sitting on your back seat on a New York City sidewalk. And so they were allowed to open up his car, check his trunk, and they found a duffel bag with ammunition, maps of New York City boroughs, a new and unreleased letter to Timothy Dowd, the head of the Son of Sam task force. Rather than try and storm his apartment, though, they decided they simply were going to wait for him to leave. Police were worried that if they cornered him in New York City's notoriously narrow apartment hallways, he'd shoot and he'd start killing civilians. They requested a warrant just to cover their bases, and also they didn't want anybody to get any crazy ideas. They wanted to have a warrant before they walked into his apartment. But around 10 p.m., the warrant still wasn't there, but David Berkowitz walked outside and got into his car. Detective John Falotico stood on the driver's side and Detective Sergeant William Gardello on the passenger side. Both drew their guns, and both were a little stunned when Berkowitz broke into a big grin and said, "Well, you got me." "Now that I've got you," Detective Falotico said, "who have I got?" "You know." Detective Falco would later tell Lawrence Klossner, who wrote the book on the Son of Sam, that Berkowitz had a soft, almost sweet voice that didn't match what they were expecting when they caught him. But he decided to play along, and he responded, "I don't know. You tell me." So the man turned his head and said, "I'm Sam." Falatico said, "You're Sam? Sam who?" And he said, "Sam, David Berkowitz." There were no theatrics, no attempt to flee, no resistance, just the quiet acknowledgement that he had been captured. From a psychological standpoint, this moment is as revealing as the killings themselves. For months, he had performed for the public and the press. These letters, the moniker, the Son of Sam, the careful mythology, all of it had been part of this very specifically constructed performance. He cultivated fear, manipulated the media, commanded the attention of one of the largest cities in the world. But in that instance, the performance ended. The person, the myth, the Son of Sam act, it stopped mattering. The real man, a small, nervous guy, was suddenly exposed. There was no audience, no more stage, no cameras to validate his identity. The psychological need to perform vanished with the knowledge that law enforcement now held control. Interviews and statements following his arrest revealed this very abrupt shift in behavior. Without an audience to impress or terrorize, Berkowitz became more introspective. It was almost mundane. The letters, of course, stopped. The headlines would continue to print his name, but the carefully curated narrative that he'd built around himself was way over. The fear he had wielded so efficiently in the streets of New York no longer required him. The city had survived, and the hunter was now the prey. The arrest also underscores the role of chance and careful police work. A parking ticket, somebody just calling the police and reporting something suspicious. A neighborhood canvass, a few persistent officers, all seemingly small details that brought a reign of terror to its end. There was no cinematic showdown, only normal police investigation meeting a killer who had, in a way, kind of grown complacent. In that quiet moment outside his Yonkers apartment, the city's nightmare ended and the killings on stage were unmasked. The myth of the Son of Sam would endure in headlines and lore. But the real David Berkowitz, the man shaped by trauma, delusion, and resentment, he was now in custody. Now, when that arrest happened on August 10th, 1977, that manhunt that had gripped New York City for over a year was finally over, but the story was very far from finished. As prosecutors began to prepare their case, Berkowitz's own words started to complicate things. In the early days, he told investigators bizarre and chilling tales. He claimed his neighbor's black Labrador retriever, a dog named Harvey, that was possessed by a demon named Sam. This wasn't just a minor, aside, though. Because he went into so much detail when he talked to the police and suggested that demons were speaking directly to him, this dog as messenger thing meant that they had to evaluate him for these delusions. But very quickly, as they looked into having conversations with him and having him speak to psychological professionals, it was very clear it was a strategic thing. He was only suggesting supernatural motivation because he was testing the legal waters to see if he could do an insanity plea. Essentially, he was trying to not get killed. And he said, maybe I can just get, a lifetime behind bars. In the months following the arrest, he underwent a lot of psychological evaluations. And the experts did note he had signs of paranoid ideation. He had very strange beliefs, but they said he's competent. This is an act. He understands his charges, and he can participate in his own defense. And that's one thing that I think people don't understand with the justice system. The psychological evaluation is not, is this person crazy? Because frankly, the justice system doesn't care if you commit a crime while you're crazy. They care if you understood you were doing a crime when you did it. If you can say to the court, well, yes, I know that it's wrong to kill people, but I did it because a dog told me so, you still knew it was wrong. So essentially, you understand right from wrong. All right, let's go to trial. It was after all of this wasted amount of energy and money, May of 1978, Berkowitz makes a surprising legal strategy. He withdraws the insanity defense and instead just pleads guilty to all 6 counts of murder and the related 7 attempts for attempted murder. He did it very calmly, almost matter-of-factly. He knew that this would lead directly to prison, and there would be no uncertainty of a jury trial. That decision mattered a lot. By pleading guilty, he forfeited any chance of being sent to a psychiatric institution. And that's a big deal. That's another thing that people think. Sometimes just because a person is labeled not guilty by reason of insanity, it doesn't mean that they avoid jail time. It actually means they end up going into a psychological prison, which is worse than a regular prison. And a lot of people who have been in psychiatric institutions that also double as jails say that it's pretty awful to be there. So this was a logical decision for Berkowitz. Essentially, if I admit that I did this, I will go to a regular prison. I will not be locked in a cell. I will not be, put in a straitjacket. And this also coincided with everything that the psychologist said. He is a rational, logical man, legally responsible for his choices, regardless of what he claimed during the interrogations from the last year. And on June 12, 1978, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. Now, in New York State, a life sentence is considered 25 years. So essentially, they gave him 150 years in prison, effectively ensuring he will never get out of prison. The demon dog story didn't survive the courtroom, and in 1979, there was a press conference and later private correspondence with David's psychiatrist, and he just straight up admitted, yeah, no, I lied. It was a hoax. I was hoping I could convince people that I was insane. He actually referred to it in the press as a silly hoax meant to influence how he might be treated, not an honest recounting of any voices or visions. So the question is, what was real then? Berkowitz's behavior reflects schizotypal traits, paranoid ideation, unusual patterns of thought and belief that can distort how someone interprets the world. But the fact that he was found to be competent at trial repeatedly suggests that he was not overtaken by uncontrollable hallucinations. What emerges is a man with a severe personality disorder. Intertwined with his narcissism, his grievance against women, and a deeply rooted desire for attention and to feel significant. Throughout all these interviews in prison and later media appearances, Berkowitz would alternate between claiming he felt psychologically a compulsion and acknowledging that he just wanted to kill. At times, he described the shooting as a break from reality. And other times he said he needed a justification, any justification, so he could tell himself he wasn't just a cold-blooded killer. David Berkowitz is still alive. He is serving a life sentence at the Shawangunk Correctional Facility in New York State. Over the decades, he has been denied parole repeatedly, most recently in May of 2024. That was his 12th attempt. And technically, he is allowed to apply for parole every 2 years from now on. So his next one would be coming sometime in 2026. David has spoken publicly about the fact that he has transformed himself while he was in prison. He has adopted a born-again Christian identity and calls himself the Son of Hope now. The trial of David Berkowitz remains significant, not just for its outcome, but for what it revealed about the intersection of myth and responsibility. Berkowitz tried to cloak himself in supernatural excuses. He externalized the blame through an invented narrative of demons and possessed animals. But the legal system treated him as a man who made choices, and he accepted that reality when he stood in court. In the end, the myth of the Son of Sam, the voice of demons, the talking dog, the grand narrative of compulsion was just part of a performance. The truth story lies in a man's choices, his calculated manipulation, the consequence of those decisions, and how they landed him in prison for life. The Son of Sam case didn't just terrorize New York City streets. It left an enduring mark on American culture. Couples avoided parked cars and quiet streets. Every shadow and siren was a reminder that a predator could strike anywhere. The panic was pervasive. It shaped daily life in ways few crimes ever do. And the media played a central role in amplifying that fear. Berkowitz's letters, his chosen moniker, the myth of the demon-possessed dog, created a storm for a sensational headline. Newspapers competed for every detail. They were running stories that turned a real terror into a public spectacle. And this case marked that media-driven fascination with serial killers, the same kind of fascination that has me making this podcast right now. The Son of Sam began the double-edged sword that allowed these men to be both creators of fear and also creators of notoriety. There is a danger when you tell the world that the more carnage you create, the more people will admire you. And there has definitely been discussion over the last several decades about whether the coverage of these kinds of cases has made the killers more prolific. The legal aftermath of the Son of Sam case was also very influential. The Son of Sam laws were enacted because of just how popular David Berkowitz was. And essentially, people said it's not fair that someone is allowed to make money off of murdering other people. And so criminals were prevented from profiting from their crimes, particularly through book deals or movie rights. And these laws changed the way the justice system interacted with the media and intellectual property, aiming to ensure that murderers could never capitalize on their infamy. This case also inspired enduring cultural portrayals. Spike Lee's 1999 film The Summer of Sam dramatized the chaos and paranoia of New York City during these murders. It heightened both the social climate and the media frenzy surrounding David Berkowitz. Books, documentaries, and, yes, podcasts continue to revisit this story, showing that it's had a lasting impact on American imagination. The Son of Sam murders reshaped perceptions of safety, media responsibility, criminal notoriety. They illustrated how a single killer could not only wreak physical havoc, but infiltrate public consciousness, altering daily behavior, legal standards, and cultural narratives for generations. The fear that David Berkowitz released was not just confined to the streets. It reverberated through law, media, and it left a legacy. David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, yes, he terrorized New York City with bullets, letters, and myth for a little over a year. He transformed fear into a performance. He turned ordinary streets into stages and headlines. Young women cut and dyed their hair. Couples avoided parked cars, the city trembled, and the media amplified every moment. But the story is not just about fear. It's also about inevitable accountability. From a parking ticket to careful police canvassing, the trail that David Berkowitz left, physical, digital, psychological, it all led to his arrest. There was no chase. Just calm, quiet policing. Well, you got me. Proof that no matter how meticulous the performance, the truth always leaves a trail. And Berkowitz tried to cloak himself in delusions, demons, letters, but the law, investigation, reality, it all caught up with him. The mythos around him remains in popular culture. Books, films, discussions of serial killers. But the man himself is constrained, a living reminder of choices, consequences, and the limits of manipulation. The story of David Berkowitz shows us that even the most terrifying acts cannot erase the inevitability of truth. Every step, every letter, every miscalculation leaves a trail. And that trail led to justice. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. If you want more deep dives into the minds behind the most extreme crimes and the investigations that caught them, you can subscribe to our Patreon, join me for our next story. You are always welcome to send me your own ideas for stories because I do read my emails. Send that to caseclosersubmissions@gmail.com. And if it's something interesting and I can find enough sources about it, I will absolutely talk about it in one of the future podcasts. Thanks for listening.